Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video I want to talk about the really fascinating and sadly long out of print 1985 tie-in novelization of The Terminator. And what's interesting about this novelization is that not only was it written by two longtime friends and collaborators of James Cameron, who also had at least some ties, or at least in Bill Wisher's case, helped develop the screenplay uncredited for the actual Terminator film, but they were writing this after the film had already been made and released, and this book came out in November of 1985. So it's one of the rare times you have a novelization written for a film after it was made and released and had achieved a certain degree of success in the original run. So that allows the writers to essentially come in and basically build upon everything we see in the film. You get the sense that they tried to do everything that was not able to be done in the film in terms of it being a more limited production, obviously. But since it's a novel form, they have the time to expand, especially upon character and internal monologue, and of course, flashbacks, memories, and other events that the film simply doesn't have time for, simply due to its narrative structure and already having a strong story focus. So this is a novelization that is thus allowed to, in a lot of ways, essentially sort of one-up the film in areas. And it's a shame that it's out of print and so tricky to find and usually quite expensive on eBay. I managed to stumble across a copy in one of my local bookstores, and I knew it was regarded rather highly as a novelization, but I didn't realize that it was actually written after the film had come out. So it had the benefit of seeing what the finished product was like and then essentially being able to build off of that. Now, it should be said there is an entirely separate novelization that sometimes gets mixed in with this one. Apparently that was only published in the UK market, and as far as I can tell, it's basically just a straight retelling of the plot as we see in the film. So basically what you would expect more from your sort of standard novelization and what most people think the tie-in novel is really all about, of just basically regurgitating the film. I still would like to read it at some point. It too is not very common, and again, because it was a British paperback, it doesn't really pop up here in the US, but for all intents and purposes, it basically is doing the sort of standard novelization approach. Now, what Frakes and Wisher do in this novelization is to, again, use the novel form to its greatest extent and get into all the characters' heads. However, this isn't just the main characters of Sarah Connor and Kyle Reese and even the Terminator in terms of the T-101, because we get great background details about all three. We get this same level of detail and characterization and internal monologue for all of the supporting characters, all of the side characters, and this is apparent from page 1 when we're getting the internal monologue of the dump truck driver from the opening when the Terminator actually arrives. We also get the internal monologue of some of the punks from the opening who are the first to feel the wrath of the Terminator, and we also get the internal thought processes of the Terminator itself, and fascinatingly get more information about its power consumption and internal battery, and that it could last 1,000 years in the current scenario before the wear and tear starts setting in. And the fact that this is starting at page 1 with even the most seemingly minute of side characters means that from page 1, the sense of world building is off the charts. Basically, this takes the whole opening act of the film, of the build-up to essentially revealing what the Terminator's goal actually is of killing Sarah Connor in the past in order for Skynet to prevent the birth of her son, John Connor, and thus leading the human resistance and turning the tide of the future war. This takes that whole opening act and allows it to play more naturally, gives us far more character detail about Sarah Connor, but also her friends Ginger and Matt, who are much more of fully rounded characters in this because, again, there's more time to play with. So characters that we liked well enough in the film for the little parts they played are greatly enhanced in this novelization. And this even goes into the side characters. Even the guy who goes to the phone booth and is rudely interrupted by the Terminator has an internal monologue and a bit of a backstory, as do the fellow workers in the crappy diner Sarah Connor works in. We get scenes of her bickering with her boss. We get further detail about even the gun shop owner and why the Terminator chooses the particular scuzzy motel as his base of operations. And the book is very fascinating when it goes into essentially the head of the Terminator itself and displaying the cold logic of how it proceeds relentlessly, which just adds further to the suspense. But probably best of all is all of the extra scenes and internal monologue for Kyle Reese when he essentially crash lands in our time. And there are a great number of sequences in addition to what we see in the film, such as his trying to obtain not just weapons but even food and learn how essentially the money system works and how he's trying to blend in and not stick out like a sore thumb, as he is obviously a man out of his time. And there's nicely bits of humor worked in throughout all of this. It helps to humanize all of the characters and the scenarios. We even get more detail and more character information about the police officers. Thus, we care a lot more when we get to the police station sequence. We know in the film that our lead detectives and the lieutenant are overworked and worn out and essentially worn down by their job, but we get that a lot more in the novelization, which even adds a little bit of texture to some of the cops working at the station, and of course the oily Dr. Sieberman as well. So there's not one aspect of this that doesn't have at least some extra bit of business or texture or detail to all of the characters, right down to even the most minute side characters who only have one scene. Every moment you remember from the film is enriched in texture and moment-to-moment detail. And with the greater emphasis on character and internal monologue, one can only use that to then further enhance the scenes that we know. And when you go back to the film, you can't not think about this novelization and what it brought to the table in terms of all of the massive wealth of additional material. So this is one of those novelizations that not only enriches the viewing experience of the film. I think it's impossible to read this novelization and then go back to the film and not recall at least some things. But it's also got all of the various deleted scenes and materials that were shot for the film that we've seen in some form on the home video releases. And while some of them were wisely cut or were cut for time, with a novel you don't have to worry as much about time since you have, roughly 250 or a little under pages to play with. And what the novelization does with all of these deleted scenes, and particularly the original version of the ending, it manages to actually, I think, further develop some of these ideas. And so while I can understand why these scenes were removed from the actual film, when you compare the deleted scenes to the presentation and the novelization with all the greater focus on characterization and internal monologue and texture and world building, all those deleted scenes actually work. But again, you do have to keep in mind the novel has a slightly not leisurely, but it's able to have a more relaxed pace as opposed to the film having just a non-stop story focus that's like a freight train, and that's part of the film's magic. But the novelization, in terms of just the deleted scenes that were removed from the actual film that were shot, I think it manages to actually improve each and every one of them, and they slot perfectly into the more relaxed pace of the novelization. So while I completely understand why these pieces were removed from the film, and it probably was a very good idea, I really like their inclusion here in the novelization. But again, you do have writers getting to basically one-up or rework or smooth over things from a finished product a year later. So that's another reason that makes this novelization so unique. And they had some ties to the actual development and writing process to begin with, so they weren't completely new to this material. Another thing is that because there is so much detail about these characters, you do view them at least a little bit differently from the film. I think you very much picture the film in your head if you're a fan while you're reading this, as the basic events are the same and it follows the same plot. but there's so much additional texture and characterization. Plus, there's no real mention of the Terminator being really described Schwarzenegger-like, essentially. So I think that brings the novelization version a bit, at least a little bit closer to the original concept of the Terminator as an infiltration unit, and thus would have a more average look in terms of looking like anybody else on the street, and thus increasing the horror factor of never knowing where this infiltration unit could be. It also seems to stress that Kyle Reese and Sarah Connor are younger in terms of being in their 20s essentially, which I don't know if that exactly exists in the film in the same way. It's never really expressly gone into about their ages or anything. But it should also be said that even though we have the inclusion of the deleted scenes from the film, and we also have just an incredible extra amount of character detail for every character that essentially has a speaking role in this story, there's also additional subplots and other little bits of business and elements that run throughout the story. I don't know if these were ever part of the original concept at one point, but for example, when the Terminator is killing the other Sarah Connors, it doesn't just kill them, it also then carries out a rather grisly sort of post-mortem examination, essentially carving open their leg looking for a metal pin that Sarah Connor was supposed to have, according to Skynet's records. It's not exactly apparent why the Terminator is doing this at first, but then it is revealed that that's just part of its information, which of course was compromised due to them only having certain parts, as the rest of the information had been wiped out during the war. So there's other little bits of business like that that run all the way throughout, and everything we see in the film is built upon, examined further, gone into further, and it's really aided by the internal monologues of the lead characters especially. But again, we get this for all the side characters. There's not a wasted moment of this book. Now, if I did have any criticism, it's that when you're reading this, there's so much additional detail, little bits of business, extra sequences, subplots, character memory flashbacks, internal monologue moments, just additional texture out the wazoo on every page, until we get to the Terminator's assault on the police station. Basically, from that point onward to the end, as we see in the film, it is very much a direct chase, and so there's obviously not a lot of room for additional details and things, but it's almost as if the writers kind of knew that if they wrote the novelization of the film exactly as we saw it in the film version, that it probably would be a rather short novel. I think what they may have tried to do is maybe consciously try to beef up or expand upon all the elements in really the first half, or maybe the first roughly 2 acts of the story. And then the final act is much more of a straight chase action adventure with, of course, additional materials and additional focus on the emotional side of our two characters, but then also having the original ending a bit more fleshed out in terms of the actual final moments and what happens after the big action climax. So you do get the sense that all the wonderful world building that you're so hooked into, it kind of gets dialed down, basically somewhere after the police station. So basically about halfway through the book. And you do have to keep in mind that they are still working around the parameters of it being a paperback novel, which is not going to let you have just a full amount of pages to write whatever you want. So they are having to write to a mass market paperback. It does run around 250 pages. And it is paced well. So when you get to that point after the police station or so, it's roughly about 150 pages in, which leaves you about 100 pages to go to the end of the story. So it's still well paced, it's still well written, but I think you can very much get a sense of it's more the first half of the story that has more additional material, more focus on expanding the story. But in doing that, it does get you more invested in the story. It gets you more invested with the character's plight. It gets you more invested in the entire experience. So by the halfway point, you're committed to getting through to the end. And there is enough peppered throughout the whole book that will make even the most diehard fans of the film who have it memorized sit up and be surprised or be interested to turn the page, because again, there's not a wasted real moment in this. So for me, I think this is one of the truly great novelizations. This is a great book in its own right, regardless of it being a movie tie-in. In terms of tone, I think the best way to describe it would be imagine if the Terminator film had been translated more into a direct science fiction novel around that time period, with maybe a little bit more of a sort of thinking man's science fiction edge. It is a bit more grounded because we get so much additional detail and additional characterization, additional subplots, but also the book has the room to do that in terms of it being about 250 pages as opposed to the film having such a tight narrative focus. And the book doesn't have to worry about the low budget and the production hurdles that the film did. And it's the writers getting to do this a year afterwards and essentially getting to look at the film. And if there was anything that maybe they thought they could improve or tweak a little bit, or some rough spots they could maybe patch over or help to fill in some gaps, they went ahead and did it. So I think this is not only one of the great novelizations, it's one of the very select few that is arguably better than the film source material itself. And I think that's the highest praise you can give any novelization. I really would put this up there with the absolute best of the best in terms of film novelizations, like Peter David's Batman Forever or David Seltzer's The Omen, the real ones that are true surprises when you read them for the first time. And even if you're a diehard fan of the film, this adds so much to the experience that I think it should be read by every fan of the Terminator. It's just an absolute shame that this is out of print and usually goes for anywhere between $50 and $100 for a paperback copy on eBay. It was apparently reprinted in the 90s, I guess around the time of T2, and there was a T2 novelization follow-up from some of the same teams, so I really want to track that down and read it because I'm sure it'll be just as excellent as this is, but unfortunately that is also out of print and a little bit pricey, but thankfully not as expensive as the Terminator novelization. So I'm just really glad that I managed to stumble across this at a decent price. I knew it was rare and hard to find, but I didn't know how expensive it actually is. So this is definitely worth it. I don't know if I would pay the exorbitant prices it goes for on eBay, but if you're a fan of novelizations, it's a must. If you're a fan of the Terminator, get this immediately because it is that important. And it's basically like the super version of the Terminator movie you know and love because everything is enhanced. Literally everything. There's not a page of untapped potential in this novelization. And you have the benefit of two writers going to need to come in and basically try and take an already great finished product and improve it further wherever they can, just in certain areas to expand upon literally everything. The sense of the world building here is off the charts. So again, I think this is truly one of the great novelizations. To briefly talk about the paperback itself, with this, of course, carries the iconic one-sheet artwork and is a really nice looking paperback, still has the sort of nice gloss finish on the cover. So this is a really nice condition copy. The only thing is apparently the original owner decided they were going to reinforce the spine with tape. So I don't know if I can really do anything about that without damaging the paperback, but still it's in great condition and I picked it up for very cheap, so I'm happy about that. The rear is pretty nice and basically gives you a nice classic feel of how films used to be sold in terms of tie-in novelizations. And as you can see, this is from the Bantam Spectra imprint. Of course, we have the title page and then, of course, the copyright information. And then here's page 1, which nicely has location and time captions, which is carried throughout the rest of the book, which very much gives you more of a pulp science fiction flavor. I think this is actually a later printing. As you can see here on the back, there's the note about the T2 novel coming in July from Bantam. So I guess this is technically the second printing edition, but unfortunately this was very limited. So both this and T2 are hard to get a hold of, but the Terminator novelization itself is much rarer and unfortunately much more expensive, but even if you had to pay $70 for a copy, if you are a diehard Terminator fan, it is worth every penny. That's how good this is. So those are my thoughts on reading the Randall Frakes and Bill Wisher 1985 novelization of The Terminator. This is a fantastic novelization. It's just a really enjoyable book in its own right. You can read this and have never seen the film and not even know the concept and just have a great time reading this. It's so well written, well structured, and well paced that you just want to read it in one sitting. You don't want to put it down. So it does retain the narrative energy of the film, even though it's not as laser focused as the film is. And you have the benefit of the writers doing this after the film was finished and released to literally make little improvements on everything, build upon the world of the film, build upon the characters, and include all of the deleted materials and actually finesse those further and invent new sequences of their own. So there is just a wealth of additional material here, and all of it will go into your appreciation of the film. If you read this novelization, all of this material will be in the back of your head, even if you're not really aware of it, every time you rewatch the film from now on. So as I said, this is basically like the Super Terminator experience and is one of the best novelizations I've ever read. And I think it's in that rare category of novelizations that equal the film experience and possibly surpass the original film it's based on. That's how great this book is. So as always, I hope my babblings about film tie-in novelizations, the lost art of the novelization, and book collecting in general has been at least somewhat fun and informative. I know this is a bit of a tricky one to track down. It is definitely pricey on the used market and on eBay, but if you're lucky as I was and you do keep an eye out in used bookstores for movie tie-in novelizations, these do sporadically appear, but it seems very uncommon. So it is a book that you will definitely have to just keep an eye out for to try and get an affordable copy, or if you're really interested, you will probably have to pay a definite price premium to get a copy on eBay. But it is really well worth it, and I hope this book is reprinted at some point. It really should be. This is not only just a major film franchise, of course, but this is such an outstanding novelization that I find it quite silly that there's not, just a modern, inexpensive paperback reprint, or better yet, one that combines the follow-up T2 novelization that I really want to get and read that thankfully seems to be a little bit more affordable. So I would hope that would happen someday, because this is so well done that I think every fan needs this on their bookshelf. If you like the Terminator at all, you need to read this book. That's how important it is. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up some classic or rare movie tie-in novelizations, and maybe if you're lucky enough, you might stumble across a copy of this incredible Terminator novelization. So definitely keep reading print books, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.